Okay, hi everyone. This is chapter 32 on Deuterostome Animals. I think you'll find this chapter to be a little more interesting maybe than the protostomes because these are going to be animals that are going to be very familiar to you for the most part. Humans are in this category. Sea urchins, whales, lions are all deuterostomes. And we're going to look at some of the characteristics that make this group, unique from the protostomes and also very diverse. So Deuterostomes, largest bodied, so this is where we find the biggest, most morphologically complex animals. Lots of innovations here that make them unique. Initially grouped together because of the features in their embryonic development. So here we're looking at, the anus forming first and then the mouth forming second when we have development taking place. Whereas with the protostomes, we had the mouth forming first. So Deuterostomes, mouth is forming second. So that means the gut is going to develop from posterior to anterior, meaning from the back to the front. For the coelom, if it's present in these, they're going to develop from out pockets of the mesoderm. And vertebrates having a backbone are going to dominate this group of animals, the deuterostomes. So we talked about the protostomes in the last lecture here. And now we're going to look at the deuterostomes, echinoderms, hemichordata, new kind of group recently discovered, the Xenoturbellida group, and the chordates, chordata, which are the backbone animals, are part of that group, among some others. Okay, so here's those four phyla. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time with the hemichordates or the Xenoturbellas. We are going to look in detail at the echinoderms and the chordates. So the echinoderms are the spiky guys. They're your sea stars, your sea urchins, and they have some unique characteristics, being radially symmetric and in their adult form. And then we're going to look at the chordates, and the chordates are the vertebrates, so animals with backbones. So we're going to see hagfish, lampreys being the more simple vertebrates, chordates. Then sharks and rays, ultimately bony fish, gave rise to amphibians, mammals, or amphibious reptiles and mammals. And for the purposes of our discussion, we're going to lump the birds in with the reptiles. Usually that's kind of the way it's done. But I have seen, different textbooks sort of grouping the birds as a totally separate group, but sometimes they're lumped in with reptiles. So for our purposes, we're going to lump birds in there. Okay, so let's talk about echinoderms, those spiny skins. They're named for the spikes of the spines that are observed in the many species that exist. And this is a really large, diverse phylum, and it's exclusively marine, so all echinoderms are marine. To date, about 7,000 species of echinoderms have been described, and they're very abundant, like I said, and we find them in deep water environments. And we're going to look next a little bit how the body plan has adapted to being in those marine and even deep water environments. So there's 5 major lineages that we see of echinoderms. We're really just going to focus on one group, Asteroidea, the sea stars, okay? Because they tend to be the most, most common probably to you that you've seen, the sea stars. And they've got, lots of arms, 5 to 40 arms coming off of them. So there's 3 main traits that are synaptomorphic, so making these echinoderms their own group. The 3 characteristics that kind of make them unique from other animals: having the radial symmetry, an inside endoskeleton made of calcium carbonate, and very unique is the water vascular system with these tube feet. So the water vascular system is really cool, and really does separate these guys from other animals. Basically, it's like a series of tubes and chambers all throughout the body plan of this thing, and it's open to the outside, and seawater is going to go into and out of this water vascular system. Fluids are going to move through cilia and it's going to allow for literally this thing to move and to move materials around in it. It's also involved in gas exchange as well when we look at the tube feet, which are a part of the water vascular system. So whereas the adults are radially symmetric, with that symmetry kind of radiating from the middle, and depending on how many arms and things this has, that symmetry is going to be all throughout. But you'll notice that the larvae are actually bilaterally symmetric. So that is something that we see that's unique to all deuterostomes. Five-sided radial symmetry, that pentaradial symmetry is what we see in the adults. Okay. And we see that very early, the pentaradial symmetry, in the evolution of echinoderms. Echinoderms, they have that endoskeleton, like I said. So hard structure inside of a thin layer of epidermal tissue, and it is formed by the secretion of calcium carbonate. So similar to what we saw with mollusks in the last lecture, these also use calcium carbonate, but rather than having shells, they have an inside skeleton similar to us. And the cells that are in there are going to make these like plates of calcium carbonate, and they'll fuse underneath of the skin, and they'll stay stiff or flexible depending on how much calcium carbonate is secreted in there. I talked a little about the water vascular system already, but basically these tubes are going to form a hydrostatic skeleton, and they're going to move water, feeding and gas exchange throughout the echinoderm's body. And connected to that water vascular system on the inside, I'll show you a picture in a second, are these tube feet. And basically they're long fluid-filled appendages that come off of the water vascular system. And that term there that is described, each of these are going to have inside. So connecting to the inside of the water vascular system are the ampulla, and then the podium are on the outside. So like podiatry, having to do with the foot. So the ampulla are on the inside, and the podium are on the outside, and collectively they make up the tube foot. But there's two parts to the tube foot, the inside part and the outside part, the ampulla and the podium. I'll show you a picture here. So we can see really in the cartoon picture, this is the water vascular system all throughout, right? All these tubes, and then you can see that this structure here, which is connected to the outside, is the tube foot. So water can flow in through the tube foot, and they can use these tube feet, for a variety of structures. They can grab, release food. They're involved in adhesion, suction, gas exchange as well, and they're connected to that water vascular system. So a pretty cool adaptation here that we don't see in any other type of animal besides the echinoderms. So I kind of mentioned this already a little bit, but the tube feet are really important in obtaining food, mass feeding, suspension feeding. We see deposit feeding. We talked about those in a previous lecture. Digestion takes place inside inside of the body in most animals, but in echinoderms, it's going to happen outside of the body. So we see this happening almost similar to fungi, where digestion takes place in outside of the body. Excretion of wastes occurs by diffusion. And these organisms have something called a nerve ring and nerve nets. So they have a simple nervous system, not as complex as us, obviously, but we do see a nervous system here, and we do see them utilizing the nervous system to communicate with other parts of the body and sense things like light and temperature, knowing where they are, status of the water around them, are all parts of that. The circulatory system consists of 3 rings, radiating around, and they're gonochorous, meaning that there's male and females with external fertilization as the means of reproduction. Okay, so here's a few of the different structures here that we talked about. If you've ever done a dissection of a starfish, you may have, you may not have. If you've taken the lab course, or if you plan to take the lab course, you will do the dissection in there, but you'd see all these structures pretty easily inside of the starfish. And for the purpose of our class, just make sure you can recognize these and look them up if you need to. Okay, so the final group, chordates. You're a chordate, and you'll see that as we talk about these, that chordates have many, many different characteristics. So just because you're a chordate doesn't mean that you're going to look like every other chordate. But some of the characteristics that are shared by chordates, and when we think about chordates, we think about the most complex animals. We think about animals with a backbone, but having a backbone does not define all chordates. They have some sort of backbone-ish thing called a notochord or a nerve cord, but only one group we're going to see actually has a backbone. But they do have a nerve cord, all of them at some point in their life cycle, jointed appendages, segmentation. They have a notochord. Okay, so the nerve cord runs along the dorsal axis, differentiates into the brain and spinal cord in higher level chordates. The notochord is just below the nerve cord. That's going to diversify into the vertebral column. Somewhere in development, there's going to be pharyngeal slits, and those slits are actually open to the outside in development, and they can become gills in animals that have gills, like fish, and disappear in those lacking gills. And a post-anal tail at some point in development, meaning that the muscle extends beyond the anus. Okay, so all chordates at some point in their lives development have these characteristics. So the phylum Chordata, so we're in the kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, subphylum here, there's three of them. Okay, the cephalochordates, the urochordates, which are actually invertebrate chordates, so they don't have a backbone, but they do have a notochord, and then the true vertebrates, which have a backbone. So it seems kind of, strange sometimes to hear invertebrate chordates, but there are groups of invertebrate chordates. So the simplest chordate, okay, that we've observed, and these are still around, are the lanceolets. So the lanceolets, these are examples of cephalochordates, meaning that they don't have a backbone. They're simple, they're small, they're little fish filter feeders. They resemble fish. They have a very simple sensory system. They're about an inch long, I'd say, probably even smaller than that, maybe a centimeter long. Their dorsal hollow nerve cord runs parallel to a notochord. You can see that the dorsal hollow nerve cord in the figure there is shown in blue, and underneath in red is the notochord. All right. And then the muscle contractions on either side of this guy result in a fish-like kind of undulating motion. So these guys, very simple, and they kind of use that movement when they're moving to get away from a predator or mate or something like that. Okay, so the vertebrates, these are more interesting. So I didn't talk about urochordates, but these are like your tunicates and your squirts. You don't need to really know about those, but in case you were wondering, you can look them up. So the different types of vertebrate that we're going to look at. So there's hagfish and lamprey, which are very simple and they're kind of disgusting. They have like a slime that builds around them. Sharks, rays are cartilaginous fish, so they're fish that have cartilage, no bones. Bony fish have fish, simply. Amphibians, frogs, salamanders, newts, these guys will live partially in the water and partially on land. We got reptiles and birds, and then we got mammals, the most complex of the vertebrates. So vertebrates represent a monophyletic group originating from a common ancestor, and they all share the characteristics of having a vertebral column and cephalization, having the concentration of their neurons in a head and a brain. If we look at other differences between this group and the other groups of chordates, they have something called a neural crest, which is a group of cells in the embryo that will differentiate into various structures in the nervous system in development. They've got more internal organs than other chordate groups, and they also have an endoskeleton as well, which is either going to be bone, cartilage, or a combination of the two, which humans have both bone and cartilage as part of our endoskeleton. We usually don't call it an endoskeleton, it's usually just our skeleton, but it is technically an endoskeleton. So if we look at the relative percentages or pie chart of the different groups of vertebrates, you can see that the vast majority is going to be the ray-finned fishes, the sharks, the rays, the skate, the hagfish, the lampreys make up a very small slice of that, but in blue we've got our totally aquatic vertebrates, and then we got amphibians, turtles, snakes, lizards, crocodiles, alligators, birds, all being tetrapods, and then we've got, meaning that they walk on their four limbs or have four limbs, and the mammals making up, again, a slice of that pie. So these are our vertebrates. So how did we get to this ultimate pathway from fish to land? So, in terms of evolution, it's believed, 470 million years ago, the first vertebrates evolved. And the very first vertebrates, again, were in the ocean. And we started with a jawless fish. And then with the evolution of the jaw, we saw these fish start to be able to eat more things and diversify, right? Because think about it, if you're a jawless fish and you're just swimming around with your mouth open, you're very limited to what you can actually eat. You can't chew, right? So you have to basically filter feed and eat plankton and things like that. But then the evolution of the jaw allowed for, much more diverse eating, and then we could expand our range even more, right? Grow larger because now we're getting more energy. Within that evolution there, we saw the evolution from cartilaginous fish to bony fish, which again allowed for more of a diversification in where they can live, because now bony fish are protected better from predators and things like that. You can see down here the kind of, lineage of these, and then the primitive amphibians started to kind of make their way on land here around the Devonian period, and then from there they further diversified into reptiles who could spend all of their time on land but still can't regulate heat. And then ultimately we get to the mammals who can spend all their time on land and can regulate their body heat. So lots of innovations along that pathway that allowed for success, leading to, ultimately the mammals from the jawless fish. So from the cartilaginous fish, the bony fish diversified, and they're the most diverse, most successful group in the marine environments and freshwater environments. They provided the avenue for the rise of amphibians. But if we focus just on fish, right, fish are able to extract oxygen from the water, which is great, through their gills, so they can take the abundance of oxygen that's there. They have a fully developed brain encased within a protective, cranial box and a spine with an internal skeleton, so a full vertebral column, and a single loop blood circulation. So the blood is pumped from the heart to the gills in fish by a four-chambered heart. Okay, so again, we're getting much more complex here. As the name implies, they have a bony internal skeleton, and externally, though, the fish are also adapted to, if a predator does clamp down on them, they won't be able to get all the way through. They're externally covered in plates and scales. Some additional adaptations to the bony fish. The swim bladder is a great adaptation. Gas-filled sac that allows them to regulate their buoyancy in the water. So it's homologous to lungs in the fact that they do inflate and deflate, but they're not used for the same level of gas exchange, obviously, than our lungs are. But they do allow the fish to regulate their buoyancy and float up and float down if necessary. Lateral line system, series of sensory organs just under the surface of the skin. So the lateral line system is, for the fish, depending on where the fish lives, will adapt differently to their location. Gill cover, hard plate called the operculum, that covers the gills. So the operculum, again, in some fish is more developed than in others, just depending on the, the predators and the mineral levels in the water and how much is needed to produce for them to be adaptively advantageous for them. All right, so here's a simple look at the fish anatomy and some of these structures that I talked about. There's the cut edge of the operculum here. There's the swim bladder, like I said, is involved in buoyancy. Okay, you got stomach, intestine, livers. There's the four-chambered heart. Tiny little brain, almost like a ganglion. Not a whole lot of thought going on there. Pretty much just eat, swim, mate. That's all they're really doing. Not a whole lot of thinking or sleeping or anything like that. So actually, before the evolution of the bony fish came the cartilaginous fish. So sharks fall under the umbrella of cartilaginous fish. So they have a cartilage skeleton, endoskeleton, streamlined body with pair of fins. These are the first developed teeth, which really greatly diversify their ability to be effective predators, which we know, right? And also their eggs are fertilized internally, so that's going to prevent the eggs from being eaten by something else. So they can be fertilized all internally and then, be birthed live. From the bony fish, the first amphibians made their way to land. So, major characteristic of the amphibians are the legs. So, some fish had some sort of random mutation adaptation that allowed it to live kind of amorphously on both the land and the water. So, amphibians do have lungs, but their lungs are not as effective as reptiles and mammals. So, they rely on something called cutaneous respiration, which is where they can actually breathe through their skin. But that also makes them really vulnerable to desiccation and drying out, and also different pathogens and things like that can also come into contact with their skin. So we see this fungus called the chytrid fungus that's really devastating to amphibians because they breathe right through their skin, and if that chytrid fungus is in the environment, they'll take it right in through their skin, and it does kill them. So we do see that happening around the world. I'm not sure, haven't been really monitoring how much it's occurring. I know about 10 or 12 years ago it was pretty bad. They have pulmonary veins, return blood to the lungs, keep a continuous high pressure pumping, so similar to our pulmonary veins. Partially divided heart, so it's not going to be the four-chambered heart, but it is going to have a separation into a pulmonary side, just dealing with going to the lungs, and then a systemic side pumping the blood out to the rest of the body. So they still are dependent on water. They need that moisture to keep their skin. Like I said, they're breathing through their skin, so they're really prone to desiccation. Okay, and they also lay their eggs, and their larvae, tadpoles, are completely aquatic. So they really are dependent on water 100%, even though they do spend part of their life on land. So you might be wondering, what would be the advantage to going on land, right? Well, there's much, much more availability of space on the land, and there's more, sometimes you can better hide from predators on the land, and there's more prey available on the land. So it just opened up a whole new category for these animals, a whole new niche for them that didn't exist in the water. Okay, so reptiles ultimately evolved from amphibians, and the major difference between these is, well, there's a couple of things. They are fully terrestrial, so they're fully on land. They do not rely on the water as to live in the water the way the amphibians do. The lungs and the heart now, in turn, are going to become much more efficient. So if the heart and the lungs are more efficient, they don't rely anymore on the, going into the water and breathing through their skin or anything like that. Skin is covered with scales or plates to minimize water loss, and you get that watertight skin. We also see the evolution here of the amniotic egg, the amniotes being very important. So amphibians would keep their eggs kind of jelly-coated in the water, and that kept them from drying out by laying them in water, whereas the reptiles, right, are going to, and this includes birds as well, are going to produce an amniotic egg, which has a protective covering that reduces the rate of drying significantly. So species that produce these amniotic eggs can actually lay them outside of water. So this was a really major evolutionary adaptive advantage. It has a food source in the egg. It has the amnion in there, which encases the embryo, the allantois, and the chorion. So the allantois is involved in removing waste products, and the chorion retains water and gas exchange. So we rely on the amniotic egg as well, and the placenta nourishing the egg internally. So this was a really important adaptation that ultimately came from the reptiles. They rely on pulmonary breathing, similarly to us, expanding and contracting the rib cage to breathe air and force it out. And they are ectothermic, meaning that they rely on the external temperature to regulate their body temperature. So if their body temperature dips below, they don't really have a mechanism to bring it back up. So you're hopefully sitting at home comfortably at 98.6, but your house is not 98.6. Your house is probably like 72 degrees, right? That's because you're endothermic, you're producing that heat. Whereas reptiles do not produce that heat for themselves. They have to kind of lay out and bask in the sun to get to their correct body temperature. Okay, so let's get to the mammals now. The mammals, again, they are distinguished. They have a lot of distinguishing characteristics. So the origins of things like lactation and fur are very important. Having mammary glands, secreting milk to produce that lactation, right? Animals can regulate their body temperature. So like I said, you're able to sit at 98.6 because you can do that. There's more of a fat layer for insulation. Again, the fur and the hair does that as well. Hair also produces camouflage. There's sensory structures. If you touch your hair, you can actually feel that you've done that. And then also in defense, it can kind of puff out and make you look larger to have that hair. So all adaptive. The mammary glands, like I said, are very important in producing milk and lactation, which nourishes young mammals. And mammals are the only vertebrates that have, interestingly enough, cheek muscles and lips that allow for suckling milk possible. So really cool. You don't see a lizard with lips. Endothermy, being able to produce your own heat, allows you to be active no matter the time of day or the environment, and it also allows for more efficient blood circulation and respiration, because that can help regulate the various characteristics of blood. pH and temperature are very important. Having the placenta, females carrying their young in a uterus during development are nourished by the placenta, so the embryo can nourish the placenta. This is a characteristic of placental mammals. And also having specialized teeth as well, not that mammals are the only animals with teeth, but they are specialized to their diet and eating habits. Okay. So the most kind of complex here group of mammals are the primates. And primates have many defining characteristics. So their hands and feet are adapted to grasping things. So having that thumb, the opposable thumb there. And there's different lineages that we can look at for primates, but we're not really going to get into that too much. But the flattened nails instead of claws on the fingers and toes are a distinguishing characteristic here that allow for better gripping as opposed to kind of tearing, I guess you can say. Relatively large brains, colored vision. We now have complex communication and social behavior, extensive parental care of offspring. So you're going to see that as these species, or as these different groups of animals became more complex, we saw more parental care of offspring. Forward-facing eyes as well, distinguishing them and making them more of a predator species. Okay. The great apes. So when we think about the great apes, we think about gorillas and things like that, chimpanzees. So great apes are also called hominids and are relatively large bodies with long arms, short legs, and no tail. Hominids have distinct ways of walking. So orangutans live primarily in the trees, but they fist walk when on the ground. Gorillas and chimpanzees knuckle walk. Okay, so they kind of walk on their knuckles. And humans are the only living great ape that is fully bipedal or two-footed, walking upright on two legs. Okay, so fossil evidence and footprints in Tanzania look to that as occurring about 3.6 million years ago, which is kind of interesting. Okay. That synaptomorphy of bipedalism defines hominins. All right, and that's the monophyletic group that includes Homo sapiens, which are the current humans. The recent Homo sapien groups are us, and 20 extinct bipedal relatives, right, that we've that are since distinct. Okay, like the Neanderthals and Homo erectus, various other ones. Okay. All right, so that will end chapter 32 on the Deuterostome Animals. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will see you next time.